Vayomer Adonai el Avram, Lech lecha me'artzecha me'moladtecha me'beit avicha el haaretz asher areka. And God said to Abram, go forth from your land, from your birthplace, from the house of your father, to the land that I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation and bless you, and your name shall be made great. Those who curse you shall be cursed, and those who bless you shall be blessed. And through you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. 4,000 years after these words were spoken, Maria Johnson, a Catholic professor of theology at the University of Scranton, was asked by her school to teach a course on the Bible. This was not her area of expertise, and she prayed to God that He guide her and prevent her from pedagogical error. Initially, Johnson decided to teach the text the way that she would any piece of literature. Most of my youth, she explains, had been spent devouring huge Victorian novels at a rate of about 1,000 pages a week. I thought if I could approach the Bible as another big novel, I might get on with it better than I had previously. Johnson, however, was not just an academic. She was also a neighbor. And next door to her, on her block, lived Orthodox Jews. And thus, every day, day by day, as she left her home to go teach her class on a biblical story that happened a long time ago, as she departed to instruct her students about a book that she was treating like a novel, what she saw was Jewish families, parents and children, mothers and fathers calling out to their sons and daughters about prosaic matters, but using the very same names of their ancestors, the very names that she had just read about in class, the very names from Genesis and Exodus. They were saying, Tzipporah, over here, honey, or put that down, Yosef. And it was then, she writes, that Johnson realized that this was much more than just an ancient story. It was ongoing. The surprise and strangeness of it, she writes, of living down the road from descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, jolted me out of my Bible as great literature phase. This was not, Johnson realized, a book whose tale had come to a close thousands of years ago. The story, she continues, was obviously alive and well. You don't run into descendants of Oliver Twist or find yourself living down the road from people who trace their ancestry back to Anna Karenina or Huckleberry Finn. When I ask God to protect my students from my mistakes, Maria Johnson concludes, it seems that I might have been the one most in need of help, and He used my Jewish neighbors to help me. So, writes Maria Johnson, and with these words, she perfectly captures the wonder that is the Hebrew Bible. What sets it apart from other texts in the history of the world? The answer, of course, as Rabbi Savage noted, begins with the ideas that the Bible contains. I will insist, John Adams once wrote, that the Hebrews have done more to civilize man than any other nation. Why? Because, Adams continued, they propagated to all mankind the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, which I believe to be the foundation of all morality and consequently of all civilization. This is John Adams. But as influential as the Bible may be, to speak only of its intellectual and moral influence is to miss out on its miraculous uniqueness. Even if no other works exceed the impact of Jewish scripture, the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh is still not the only text that has changed the course of humanity. There is Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, John Locke, the Declaration of Independence, and much else. What Maria Johnson is keyed into is that what sets the Hebrew Bible apart is that it is the only ancient story from thousands of years ago which continues today with descendants tracing themselves to original characters in the Bible, utilizing the very same language, giving their children the very same names from generation to generation. There are today no self-identified family members of Achilles or Odysseus or Confucius or Aristotle or Cicero or Julius Caesar who live in Scranton or Sydney or London or Rome or Shanghai or Athens or Jerusalem, raising descendants of these early figures, teaching them to revere the beliefs for which their ancestors lived. But the children of Abraham endure, survive, thrive, and transmit his beliefs today. What Maria Johnson discovered is that while the Bible is about a nation and a faith and a land, and Abraham's blessings are bound up with all of these, it is first and foremost the story of a family, of a patriarch and a matriarch who brought a child into the world, and thereby their children's 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 define themselves today by these ancestors. Of course, in the Bible, we will encounter heroes who did not descend from Abraham, who joined the Jewish people, and this will include women like Zipporah and Ruth and others. But in their conversion, in their joining, they became part not only of the Jewish faith, but also the Jewish family, and perpetuated the Jewish faith by perpetuating the Jewish family. Indeed, we only get David because Ruth, the Moabite convert, does just that. The Hebrew Bible centers on the story of the family of one man, Abraham, and his children. Even God in the Bible is not known first and foremost as the God of creation or the Lord of the world or even of the Holy Land or of the nation of Israel. Instead, he seeks to be known as the God of parents, children, and grandchildren. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and therefore of their descendants who continue to have children and grandchildren today, who continue the story of the Hebrew Bible today in a way that cannot be said of any other ancient text. And to many throughout history, this is a scandal. Why does the Lord of all creation seek to be known to humanity first and foremost through one family? This complaint was expressed most famously in a small poem uttered by a British journalist. How odd of God to choose the Jews. The sentence smacks of what was often an anti-Semitic strain in Christianity, which is why the standard response to how odd of God to choose the Jews has always been, but not so odd as those who choose a Jewish God and spurn the Jews. Today, however, much of this has been reversed. There are now millions of Christians who see the continuity, the existence of the Jewish family, of Abraham's family, as a miracle, while there are many modern Jews who are themselves deeply uncomfortable with the notion that they are called upon to perpetuate a faith by bringing Jewish children into the world. The time then is ripe to examine the story of Abraham anew and to understand how the book of Genesis from its very outset is not only about the creation of the world, but about the creation and the formation of the institution of the family, in all its falterings and failures, but also in its achievements. And so, in this lecture, it is to Genesis that we turn, first to its early chapters, and then to the tale of Abram, the star of our story. The world is created in 7 days. On the 6th day, we meet the first man. His very name connotes his material nature. He is Adam, because he is made afar min hadamah, formed from the dust of the earth. But unlike the plants, the birds, and the animals that preceded him, Adam's life is not a mechanical manifestation of his corporeality. Rather, we are told of a spiritual component to his nature, a divine breath. Vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim, and God breathed into Adam the spirit of life, and he became a living being. Adam's exalted status is reflected in the fact that, unlike most animals, he has the gift of speech. And therefore, when Adam is first introduced to his wife, who has been formed from him, the first sentence in all of human history is spoken, and we expect something extraordinary. And what he says is, "This one at last is flesh of my flesh. Lezot yikarei isha ki me'ish lukacha zot. This shall be called woman, Isha, for she was taken from Ish, man." That's all he says. He does not speak to her, And he gives her not a personal name, but a typological name, woman. Note what Adam does not do. He does not engage the woman in conversation. He does not talk to her about his hopes and his dreams. He does not even say, "Madam, I'm Adam." All he does is name her, and names her by way of a possessive pun. I am Ish, man, so she is Isha. She comes from me. It's a name that is literally self-ish, highlighting that the relationship is about himself, and it is all downhill from there. The first conversation in the Bible that is recorded is between the woman and the serpent. And after the sin, Adam uses his speech to deny all responsibility. The woman that you gave me, God, she gave me the forbidden fruit, so really it's her fault and your fault. At this point in the story, family as an institution appears doomed, and death is foretold. Dust thou art, says God, and to dust thou shalt return. And suddenly, at that moment, upon pondering his mortality, Adam gives his wife a personal name. He calls her Chava, Eve, which means Em Kol Chai, mother of all creation. He realizes that Eve is the one who will bear children. As Leon Cass puts it, Adam, in awe and gratitude, names her anew as mother, this time with no reference to himself. Through children, man and woman, male and female, finally achieve some genuine unification. The two become one through sharing generous, not needy love for this third being, the child, as good. Meaning that it is the possibility of love and creation beyond oneself that truly offers hope, new hope, following the introduction of death into the world. But even as Adam understands that children are a source of immortality in the face of finitude, there is nothing moral, intellectual, or spiritual about Adam's perpetuation. We do not find that Adam teaches his sons anything, or we don't find him interacting with his progeny at all. In his descendants, Adam sees physical immortality, but nothing else. The Bible begins by describing the formation of family, but the family we find is imperfect. 10 generations pass. Members of humanity are at each other's throats, and their violence brings about their destruction in a flood. One man and his 3 sons survive. Having witnessed the death of humanity, Noah is emotionally overcome by what he has witnessed and drinks himself to a naked stupor. One son excitedly reports on his father's disgrace, but the other 2, Shem and Yefet, with the former seemingly leading the initiative, care for, honor their father, and cover up Noah. This is not only the first time that we see an interaction between father and child in the text, it is also the moment in which reverence for one's predecessors is invented, the first time that honor for parents is shown. And upon coming to, Noah curses the son that has disrespected him and prophetically blesses his other children. Yaft Elokim liyefet v'yishkon ba'ol Shem. God will bring beauty to Yefet, but he will dwell in the tent of Shem. Meaning from Yefet will descend a civilization that will bring beauty to the world. For the rabbinic tradition, this is a reference to Athens, to the contributions of Greece. But Noah stresses that the dwelling place of the divine will be in the tent of Shem, Abraham's ancestor. Note, ladies and gentlemen, what Noah does not say. He does not prophetically assert that God will be found in the temple of Shem or in the country of Shem, but rather in the tent, in the very same humble desert domicile in which he was honored by his child. There will be other nations who will impact the future of the world, but, says Noah, it is among the tent of the Semites, what will ultimately be called the Jewish home, the Jewish family, that God will first and foremost be found. Noah's words are a prediction of what is yet to come. But here too, as with Adam, the full biblical vision of the family has yet to be fulfilled. Shem honors Noah, but Noah is not depicted teaching Shem. There is gratitude to the past, but the past does not think about posterity. Noah does not act pedagogically toward the next generation. He does not work to transmit eternal truths to those who are yet to come. Another 10 generations go by, and we are introduced to a descendant of Shem by the name of Abram. It is important at this point to situate our hero historically. This is the beginning of the second millennium BCE. The civilization of Sumer is the center of achievement. Paganism suffuses the earth. All knowledge of a single creator God has been lost. Nature itself is deemed divine. As the writer Thomas Cahill points out, the ziggurats of Abram's era, which seek to bridge the earth and heaven, reflect how Sumerians looked up at the sky and saw only cycles, the waxing and waning of the moon, the endless arc of the sun and the stars, and concluded that life on earth mirrored that in heaven, which meant that human lives were an endless cycle of birth and death. There was no goal toward which to strive. From the biblical text, we know next to nothing of Avram himself, except that his name means mighty father and that he is born in Ur-Kasdim, a center of Mesopotamian civilization. His father journeys with the family to Haran, another Sumerian city. There they prosper, and at the age of 75, the God that everyone has forgotten issues a call to Abram. Lech lecha, go forth, and I will make you into a great nation. In the pagan setting in which Avram finds himself, the notion that such a promise could be fulfilled, that something radically new could occur, was unthinkable. In this civilization, God's promise to Abram marks an impossibility. Thomas Cahill points out that Avram's contemporaries would have laughed at his dream and pointed to the heavens, where the life of earth had been plotted from all eternity. In the ancient world, Cahill continues, Avram would have been given the same advice that wise men as diverse as Heraclitus, Lao Tzu, and Siddhartha would one day give their followers. Do not journey, but sit. Compose yourself by the river of life. Meditate on its ceaseless and meaningless flow. Why does God call to Avram? What makes him different? We are told in the text nothing of Avram's childhood, of how he came to know of this one God who exists beyond the cycles of earth and sky and is therefore not bound by them, a God who created the universe and endowed it with purpose. But Avram must believe in this God, must somehow intuit that monotheism is true and that it makes free will, change, and progress possible. This is clear because of what he does next. Vayelech Avram, says the text, and Avram went. These two words, Cahill continues, signal a complete departure from everything that has gone. Out of Sumer, civilized repository of the predictable, comes a man who does not know where he is going, but goes forth into the unknown wilderness under the prompting of his God. Out of the human race which knows in its bones that all of its striving must end in death comes a leader who says that he has been given an impossible promise. Out of mortal imagination comes a dream of something new, something better, something yet to happen, something in the future. So Avram went, and his faith fuels his journey. But is he the only believer on earth? Many biblical readers assume as such, and indeed assert that this is why God has chosen him. This is why, to the bit of verse, how odd of God to choose the Jews, Jews have often quoted in response another very British bit of poetry. Not odd, you sod, we Jews chose God. According to this understanding, Avram is chosen by the Almighty because in a world of pagans, he is the first monotheist. But this interpretation is almost immediately refuted by the text. It is not long after Abraham's arrival in the land of Canaan that he meets a mysterious king who also seems to serve as some form of a cultic priest, a man by the name of Melchizedek, king of Shalem, Kohen Le'el Elyon, the priest to the Most High God. The city of Shalem will later be known as Jerusalem, a hint to the eternal link between monotheism and that site. And while Melchizedek's own larger role remains murky, what is obvious is that he and Abraham share one profound idea, declaimed by this king and then embraced by Avram. Melchizedek says, "Blessed is Avram to El Elyon, the Most High God, Konei Shamayim Va'aretz, the creator of heaven and earth." There are then other monotheists. That Abraham is a monotheist is essential, but we haven't yet discovered what makes him singular. And for this, we turn to the very next passage in Genesis. The Almighty informs Abraham that because of his faith, because he answered God's call, because he believed that this God could make human progress possible, a journey possible, he was to be greatly rewarded. And Abraham, who up to this point has said nothing, suddenly bursts out with a cry, not of gratitude, but a plaintive plea. Matiten li vanochi holech ariri. What will you give me, God? He asks. I have no child. It is astonishing. The God he has followed across a continent promises him reward beyond imagination, and his reaction is audaciousness and chutzpah. So what, he says? Where's my son? But God is not angered by this reply. He takes Abram outside and informs him that your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. The fact that Abraham desperately desires to be a father is the very source of God's love for him, the very reason why he, not Melchizedek, will be the vehicle of God's providential plan. Abraham is not the only man in the ancient world to know of a creator, but he's the first to dream of founding a family that would transmit this monotheistic truth from generation to generation. He is, in other words, the first to conceive of combining physical perpetuation with moral transmission. Adam, as we saw, was a physical being endowed with speech and spiritual capacity. But Adam, in his children, saw only biological continuity and nothing more. Abram, in contrast, sought to combine his physical, mental, rhetorical, and spiritual capacities in order to overcome mortality, to not only bring children into this world, but to teach them and raise them, to perpetuate both his body but also his beliefs. So glorious a vision is this that God himself falls in love with it and falls in love with Abraham. And God in the text tells us so. It was my grandfather, Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik, who noted that everyone looks in vain to the early story of Avram, where the Torah's text tells us nothing, and ask, if Avram is the first monotheist, why are they not describing his journey? And my grandfather said that Avram was a monotheist indeed, but not the first. And he is chosen not only for that, but because he wants to be a father, and God says this explicitly in his story. Ki yidativ, for I have known him, I have loved Abram, I have chosen him, leman asher yitzaved banav et beito acharav v'shamru et derech Hashem, so that he will command his children and household after them that they will keep the ways of God. Avram was loved by God because of his qualifications, not only as a believer, but also as a faithful father. The creator of the world calls himself the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because he wants a family that perpetuates the knowledge of his existence from parent to child. Abraham is chosen because he fully grasps what Adam and Noah only glimpse, that children are the secret to eternity if we combine perpetuation with moral and spiritual transmission. Soon after this promise of a child, God informs Avram that his wife would bear him a son, Isaac. Avram's name is changed, enlarged to Avraham, which means Avhamon Goyim, father of a multitude of nations. And his wife's name is changed as well, from Sarai, my princess, to a universalized form, Sarah, humanity's princess. They are father and mother of nations. This hints to the fact that Abraham and Sarah, through their lived example, communicate to all the nations God's vision of what it means to be a father and mother. It is in Abram that Noah's prophecy is fulfilled. God will dwell in the tent of shame. What this means is not only God will be made known through Avram's family, but it is through the institution of family that God can be experienced. It was a Jewish woman who once remarked that now that I'm a parent, I know what it's like to be God, because now I know what it's like to create someone that you can't control. It's a funny statement, but it's also a true one. God creates out of love, and we as parents do the same. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, building on this quote, notes that I was once tempted to write to the great physicist Stephen Hawking after reading the book A Brief History of Time. Hawking writes that if the unified field theory was discovered, it would explain the structure of the universe, and then we would know the mind of God. I wanted to tell him, Rabbi Sacks writes, that from a Jewish perspective, you don't need theoretical physics to come as close as we can to the mind of God. All we need to know is what it is to be a parent. Parental love is itself an echo of God's love. God may beautify Yefet, but he is found in the tent of shame, in the domicile of Abraham, in the home of Jewish mother and father. Thus is parental love placed at the center of the Jewish faith. And nothing signifies this centrality more than the command that follows the prophecy of the birth of Isaac. Circumcision, the obligation to mark our son's generative organ. we thereby sanctify the obligation to bring children into the world. By marking our sons, we remind them of their own obligation to continue Abraham's dream of fatherhood. And we also remind parents that every child born to us is akin to Isaac, a gift and the source of our perpetuation. Spinoza, in a famous quote, cites the role of circumcision in guaranteeing the endurance of the children of Israel. But while the quote is often cited positively, Spinoza meant it as a critique. He wrote about the Jews, as to their continued existence for so many years when scattered and stateless. This is in no way surprising, since they have separated themselves from other nations to such a degree that they incur the hatred of all, and this not only through external rites alien to the rights of other nations, but also through the mark of circumcision which they most rigorously observe, and by itself might preserve their nation forever. Circumcision sets us apart. Being apart is why we are hated. But the truth, I think, is the opposite. It is true that Jews are apart. But in the midst of hate throughout the generations, what allowed the Jews to endure was all that circumcision embodies. That for us, bringing children into the world at any time is the source of our greatest joy. This was, for them, light in the midst of darkness. I had the chance to reflect on this when my own eldest son's circumcision took place on December 25th. My friends found this amusing. A man who studies Jewish and Christian theology is marking this very Christian holiday with a very Jewish ritual. And they all went out of their way to wish me a Merry Brismas. But the truth is that it inspired me to reflect on how the Brit Milah, the circumcision, lies at the heart of the Jewish survival as a minority in the countries in which they lived throughout history. The cry of the child seemed to reflect the Jewish cries throughout the generation, and the joy of the moment amongst parents and grandparents seemed to capture the very source of our endurance, that we treasured the gift of children above all else. At the circumcision, the father and mother are blessed with today with the same words applied at the celebration of the birth of a daughter. Just as he or she has entered the covenant, so may he enter a life of Torah, the wedding canopy, and good deeds. To the outsider, these words are striking and strange. The child has just been born, and we are already envisioning his or her wedding. But the statement is for father and mother, and it is reminding them that it is our obligation to seek to ensure that the life they lead is a Jewish one, a continuation of Abraham and Sarah, and that they ultimately build Jewish families of their own. And these words contain an implicit warning that the very love of children can lead to possessiveness. And if we see our children as belonging to us, and only us, we may turn our children toward our own selfish ends. And thus, precisely after Abraham's dream of a son has been granted, after we are told of the circumcision of Isaac, we read in Genesis of the Bible's most terrifying tale of all. Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. Abram, as we know, obeys, offers to God his son, who is saved at the last minute and bestowed back to his father. In this moment, in this act, Abraham acknowledges that Isaac is not his, but rather God's, that he was merely a custodian of the child for whom he had longed. God's intended result was not Isaac's death, but Abraham's recognition of the true nature of parenthood. And that is precisely what is recognized by Jewish parents throughout the generations. Or, as Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik puts it, the father must always remain aware that it was only through God's infinite grace that this infant was returned to him in sacred trust. For many modern Jews, the story of the offering of Isaac is an embarrassing anachronism, utterly irrelevant to our lives. The haunting possibility, however, is that it's painfully relevant. As Leon Kass has noted, all fathers devote or sacrifice their sons to some god or other, to mammon or malach, to honor or money, pleasure or power, or worse, to no God at all. It is true, Kass concedes, that they do so less visibly and less concentratedly, but they do so willy-nilly, through the things they teach and respect in their own homes. They intend that the entire life of the sons be spent in service to their own ideals or idols, and in this sense they do indeed spend the life of their children. True fathers, however, by devoting his son to the only to the godly ways, must be willing cast rights to part with his son as his son, recognizing him, as was Isaac, and as indeed are all children, as a gift and blessing from God. We are defined as a people or as a society by what we value. And Abraham's truest legacy is as a parent and how he saw his child. I thought of Cass's words when I recently learned of one of the most interesting, amusing, and moving Jewish stories that occurred during the current pandemic. The tale concerns Rabbi Yair Baich, who is the Chabad rabbi on the island of Cyprus, right across the Mediterranean from the state of Israel. Rabbi Baich and his wife were expecting a baby, a son, on March 19, 2020. He had originally planned to have the family mohel, or circumciser, travel from Israel to perform the ceremony, but on March 12th, as the new COVID rules went into effect, the mohel informed the rabbi ahead of the birth that the travel in and out of Israel would obligate him to then quarantine himself upon return and miss many other circumcisions, so he couldn't come. The rabbi, meanwhile, could not go to Israel from Cyprus because then he would be quarantined there and couldn't make it back to his flock in Cyprus. Rabbi Baich worked on this and then found another mohel in Israel by the name of Shimshon, who was willing to come, perform the circumcision in Cyprus, and go back and quarantine himself. But then Cyprus shut its airport. At that point, Rabbi Baich proposed an aquatic operation. He would leave Cyprus on one boat with the baby. Shimshon would depart Tel Aviv on another watercraft. Shimshon would board the Baich boat, and the circumcision would be performed in the middle of the Mediterranean. Interviewed on the podcast Israel Story, Rabbi Baich was asked, "You were ready to take your newborn son on a boat and have him circumcised in the middle of the sea?" And Rabbi Baich responds in typical Israeli fashion. He says, "Sure, no problem." He says, "Not like a small boat, a big yacht, a very nice one," he says. Shimshon the mohel was game. He was, as Rabbi Baich put it, a very cool guy. But when the baby was born on the due date, Cyprus had already closed its port. And so, as the podcast put it, Yair's circumcision naval operation was dead in the water. The baby was born on time. 7 agonizing weeks went by without a circumcision for baby Baich. And finally, after reaching out to Israel's president and interior minister, a whole new operation was planned. A small private plane would take the rabbi, his wife, and children on the 5 or 10-minute flight to Tel Aviv. In the airport, a room with glass walls before passport control was set aside for the circumcision. The mohel would meet them there. The Baich family this way doesn't officially enter the country. The grandparents who are in Israel can watch the circumcision from the other side of the glass, technically inside Israel. And then as soon as the circumcision is done, the parents of the child could board the plane with their son and head back to Cyprus for a 2-week quarantine. And that is exactly what occurred. When you listen to this interview, you cannot help but ask, what kind of country would turn itself inside out for one circumcision? What sort of government interior minister would come up with a complex bureaucratic immigration scheme on behalf of one baby so this baby could visit an airport for a 20-minute religious ritual? Who would do this? The answer is precisely a country formed by a people that treasured raising children above all else. The one country in the Western world that has continued to have many children, even amongst its citizens that are not rigorously religiously observant. Precisely in a country made up of Jews whose delight in children as a gift from God is what sustained them through centuries of exile so that they could ultimately return to the land that was promised to their ancestor Abraham. And so, the ceremony in Ben Gurion Airport went forward. Online, one can find recordings of the ritual and images of that moment. And it is so moving because it seemingly captures the tale of Abraham himself. In the midst of a disease, facing the specter of mortality and death, there is a celebration by Jews of new life and of continuity. Many millennia after Abraham and Sarah defied the cyclical pagan prediction of his age, to journey to the Holy Land, to found a covenantal family, a man and a woman who traced their ancestry to Abraham, journey to the very same land, and immediately upon arrival initiate their child into the covenant of Abraham, bestowing a Hebrew name upon him, as Abraham did for Isaac so many thousands of years ago. Grandparents, parents, and children gather on different sides of the glass for a brit milah, for a circumcision, socially distanced, but existentially united, as we are, as Jews, with past and posterity. Because of Abraham's defiance of the pagan notion of fate, because of his journey to the Holy Land, because he did what his contemporaries deemed impossible, Thomas Cale concludes that now most of our best words, new, adventure, surprise, unique, individual, person, vocation, time, history, future, freedom, progress, spirit, faith, hope, justice, are the gifts of the Jews. So Cale writes about Abraham's journey thousands of years ago. And thousands of years later, with the Bayich family, emphasizing the Jewish ability to achieve freedom, future, progress, and hope, we find a father, a descendant of Abraham, journeying to a Jewish state whose national anthem is the hope. A Jewish state that just 100 years before was barren, almost as barren as it was when Abraham first arrives. And now he, the father, stands in a Jewish state surrounded by a Jewish civilization, pronouncing liturgical words sanctified by generations. Vayamal Avraham et Yitzchak beno, kasher tziva oto Elokim. And Abraham circumcised Isaac as God had commanded him. Hodu la Hashem ki tov ki liolam chasto. Praise the Lord, for he is good, for his goodness endures forever. Maria Johnson was right. Nothing captures Abraham's tale more than the fact that even today, Jewish parents lovingly call out to their Jewish children, revealing the power of parental love and sacred transmission to be more powerful than their persecutors, thereby teaching the world about the blessing of parental love. Johnson herself seems to sense this, reflecting on the Jewish homes that surround her own and the many enemies that have attempted to destroy the Jewish people. She writes that, quote, "It doesn't make any sense that there are menorahs and sukkahs and crowds of noisy kids in costume on Purim on my block. It defies all conceivable logic that a tiny nation like Israel should have survived, while civilizations and empires have risen, triumphed, and crumbled into oblivion. But," she concludes, "in defiance of logic, here they are, a blessing to the nations and a blessing to me." Thousands of years ago, God called out to Abraham and told him to journey, to found a family. Thousands of years later, parents reify the astonishing fulfillment of Abraham's dream merely by calling out to their children in sacred, humble homes in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and around the world. And it is in recognition of this miracle that Abraham's tale continues to call out to us. Thank you very much.